So we start a new video, and this video, believe it or not, is going to be on brakes for the rear of the C10. Now, in order to do the brakes, this is what they call a complete spring set, hardware set, and they completely miss these parts. Not that they should be there, because that would be expensive, but we need to clean these parts up so that they look like these parts. After you've disassembled your brakes and got all the pieces apart and decided whether you're going to replace wheel cylinders or not and new hardware, what your next step would be to clean up the parts that you need to reuse, the parts that don't come in a kit. So that includes the emergency brake arm, self-adjuster, self-adjusting arm, link, guide plate, the spring that goes on the self-adjusting arm, the pivot, and the self-adjusting activation link. So now let's start putting parts on the car. Time to put the wheel cylinder in, and if you took it out, you know there's two bolts that hold it in. There's not much to change it, and if you're this far into your brakes, you might as well put new wheel cylinders in for the price. One wheel cylinder installed. So the emergency brake arm is attached to the rear primary shoe, which has a larger pad on it by a little clip here. And I put a little dab of grease in there between the pivot and the shoe so that it works freely. There we go, there we go. Here is a close-up of the emergency brake arm attached to the rear brake shoe by a little clip. The rear brake shoe is the primary shoe and has the most material on it. Next step is to assemble the self-adjusting arm to the pivot point using the override spring, self-adjusting override spring. So self-adjusting override spring just goes in the hole, pivot goes in the pivot slot, and the spring goes around the idler like that. I'll show you a close-up. So here's the self-adjusting arm, the self-adjusting arm override spring, and the pivot. People go about assembling brakes on cars different ways, and now this is just the way I happen to do it. It may be better for somebody to do it a different way. But I like to get it so that the shoes will actually hang on the car and I can start putting parts on it. And the way I do that is I take the self-adjuster, and what do they call this thing? My chart doesn't have a name for this. This is the spring that goes over the top of the self-adjuster, but I like to make it so that the shoes will hang on the vehicle and I can add parts to it. And the way I can do that is by using the self-adjuster and the self-adjuster spring. And what you can do is use the shoes as a lever to get that spring in place, and as long as the shoes stay together like that, they'll hang together. So now I can go hang this on the car. So let's go to the car. So the first thing we got to do back at the vehicle is put this emergency brake cable into its slot on the emergency brake cable arm. like that. I can't show that to you any better than that. And then this whole assembly gets pushed up onto here, engaging the two rods, pistons from the wheel cylinders, and the whole thing will hang right there, just like that. The shoes are hanging off of the wheel cylinder without any pins and any hands holding it. So the next step is to put this pin in right here. And this is the tough one because a lot of stuff hangs on this pin. These are called nails. I know you can see why they call it a nail. It looks like a nail. But to me it's a retainer pin, but they call it a nail. So we got to take the nail. It goes through the primary shoe. It goes through the self-adjuster arm. It goes through a pivot point. Then it goes through a spring and then a retainer. And you got to get all that on there without the thing falling apart. What we have now is the wheel cylinder installed, the emergency brake cable is engaged to the parking brake cable, which is right there. The self-adjusting arm with all its springs and pivot points are installed, and it's all held in place by this one pin right here. So if you don't do anything else, replace that pin. So the front shoe is just held in place by this spring right here and the self-adjuster, and nothing on this side. So the next thing we're going to put in is what they call the guide plate. There we go. And then the guide plate. We'll put the return spring in here. And then when all else fails, I use a pair of needle nose. And most of these springs you can maneuver a little bit. So this has got to go over. This has got to go over the hook here. Like that. So the rear shoe is on. And we have the return spring and the self-adjuster and the self-adjuster override spring and the self-adjuster arm and the self-adjuster itself with its spring, and then the secondary shoe here in the front. The secondary shoe in the front is not even held in by a pin yet, and what we need to do is put in the link between the emergency brake cable lever and the front shoe, and that's this bar right there. So let's do that. So this is what they call the strut, and it goes between the emergency brake cable lever and the front shoe. And this is what they call a strut spring. They don't tell me which way this knob is supposed to go. So on the strut itself, there's a form for where there's a bend, so it'll go back and be able to engage the emergency brake lever. And on the other end is a place for this spring to go. It sits in there like that. Because we don't have the front shoe pinned in, we can move it to get it to put that strut where it belongs, like so. Let me show you. So hidden way down deep in here is the strut. That's one end of it. and the other end's over there. It's very easy to put it in there because this front shoe is not fastened yet. And that's the next thing to do. We're going to put the pin or the nail in to hold this shoe in place. Okay, the last spring to go in here is the return spring for the front shoe, which will then hold everything together. And that goes in this hole like so. And it wants to get wrapped around the anchor. And I have a brake tool for this. Oh. Oh, sucker. There we go. So the shoes now float, as they should, and the adjuster adjusts as it should. So the only thing left to do is put a drum on here. Let's do that. Oops, no, there's one more thing I just saw that I made a mistake on. Boy, I've been making mistakes. Here's a close-up of the brakes installed. And what's missing is right here, and I don't know if you can see it, but right there, there's a tab. And this spring goes between the tab and the brake shoe. And it's called the self-adjusting arm return spring. So, but I think I can sneak it in there, so just hold on one second. Okay, catastrophe averted. The spring is in there. And just in case this might help somebody, let's go around this one more time with a flashlight and see if we can light up anything that somebody might want to see or where it goes. Right there, that blue spring is the strut spring or anti-rattle spring. And down there, self-adjuster. And all that self-adjuster apparatus. There's a bunch of stuff there. That back pin, there's a lot of stuff that goes on underneath that pin. You get that mastered and you got the whole thing going. Okay, so let's put the drum on and adjust up the brakes. What you do to adjust your brakes to get a pretty good initial setting is adjust the adjuster out so that you got just a little bit of drag on your drum. So it should be very sloppy right now. Okay, see, there's no drag there at all. So we have to adjust this out. Oh, that works. Let's just use the adjuster. Okay. So I went too far. I'm gonna go back. That's not bad. So there's just a little bit of drag there. So that's where I'd start. I'd test drive it, and then I'd tighten them up a little more. But for right now, that's good. Now what I did is I just used the self-adjuster arm to push down on the star wheel to tighten it up. So we could tighten it up a little bit more if we wanted to. Now I may not be able to get the drum on. Oh boy. Oh, that's too tight. All right. So that's good. So that's rear brakes on a C10. I hope you enjoyed the video. There'll be more. Bye. Oh.